The house was quiet, blanketed in the soft warmth of an autumn afternoon. I was staying at my friend Lisa's home while she was away on a weekend trip, and the peaceful solitude of her guest room had been a welcome retreat. I'd spent the morning settling in, folding clothes neatly into the dresser by the window, enjoying the gentle rustle of leaves outside. It felt comforting, this temporary escape from the rush of my usual routine. The calm was suddenly interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Surprised, I turned, expecting that maybe Lisa had returned early or forgotten something. But as the door creaked open, I was met with a figure I recognized only from passing glimpses, the neighbor she had mentioned in passing, Mr. Hale. He was older, 70 if I remembered correctly, but his posture and mannerisms held a certain grace, a quiet, dignified strength. His presence filled the room, even as he stood in the doorway, his eyes sharp but warm as they settled on me. "I'm so sorry," he began, his voice low and filled with a kind of gentle authority. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'm just checking on the house while Lisa's away. She mentioned you'd be here, but I didn't expect anyone at this hour." I found myself caught off guard, stammering a little as I replied, "Oh no, it's no problem at all. I was just settling in." My voice sounded more nervous than I'd intended, a strange flutter rising in my chest at his unexpected presence. He nodded, a soft smile curving his lips. "Good. I hope you're finding everything to your liking." "Yes, thank you," I replied, feeling a surprising warmth in my cheeks. His gaze lingered for just a moment, a beat too long, and I felt my pulse quicken. It was the kind of look I hadn't received in years, one filled with curiosity, respect, and something else I couldn't quite place. The silence stretched, a strange, charged stillness settling between us. I was aware of every detail in that moment, the soft rustle of the curtains, the faint scent of his cologne, a mixture of cedar and spice that felt oddly comforting. He stepped inside, his movements slow and careful, as though he didn't want to disturb the fragile atmosphere that had formed in the room. "Forgive me," he said, breaking the silence with a hint of a smile, "but I seem to have forgotten my manners. Would you care to join me for tea? There's a lovely cafe just around the corner." I hesitated, caught between surprise and an inexplicable pull to accept. There was something about him, a quiet magnetism that drew me in, and before I could fully process it, I heard myself agreeing. "That sounds nice. I'd like that." Minutes later, we were walking through the quiet streets, side by side, our steps slow and unhurried. The conversation flowed easily, surprising me with its warmth and depth. He shared stories from his years in the neighborhood, tales filled with humor and insight, each one more captivating than the last. I found myself drawn to his voice, to the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, to the warmth that seemed to radiate from him. By the time we reached the cafe, the initial surprise of his visit had given way to a comfortable familiarity, an unspoken understanding that we were both enjoying this unexpected connection. We sat by the window, the afternoon sun casting a soft glow over us as we sipped our tea, and I couldn't help but notice the way his gaze lingered, as if seeing me anew with every glance. "So tell me," he asked, his voice gentle, "what brings you to this quiet corner of the world?" I laughed softly, the sound surprising even me. "Honestly, I'm not sure. I think I needed a break from everything." He nodded, his expression thoughtful, as if he understood more than I'd said. "Sometimes, a quiet escape is just what we need to remind ourselves of what truly matters." His words resonated deeply, filling me with a warmth that had been absent for so long. It was strange, the way he seemed to see through me, to understand the things I hadn't said. We fell into a comfortable silence, each sip of tea drawing us closer, as though every small gesture and glance held a meaning we both understood but dared not speak. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, and I felt a pang of regret at the thought of parting ways. As if sensing my reluctance, he looked at me, his gaze steady, his eyes holding a depth that made my heart skip a beat. "Would you like to continue this conversation back at the house?" he asked, his voice soft, but laced with an intensity that left no room for misunderstanding. I hesitated, feeling a shiver of anticipation run through me, a thrill that I hadn't felt in years. In that moment, I knew that this was more than just a chance meeting, that something unspoken and profound was unfolding between us. I nodded, unable to find the words to express the longing that had taken hold of me, and together, we made our way back to Lisa's house. When we arrived, the rooms were filled with the soft, dim light of dusk, casting everything in a warm, golden hue. I led him to the guest room, feeling an inexplicable need to share my space with him, to let him see this part of my life that had, until now, felt empty and solitary. He followed me inside, his steps slow, his gaze attentive, as though he were taking in every detail, every nuance. The silence between us grew heavy, thick with anticipation, and I felt my heart race as he stepped closer, his presence filling the small space with an energy that left me breathless. He reached out, his hand gentle as it came to rest on my arm, a touch so light it was almost imperceptible, yet it sent a shockwave through me. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. I nodded, unable to speak, feeling the warmth of his hand seep through me, grounding me even as it set my pulse racing. His touch lingered, a silent question in the space between us, and I felt an overwhelming desire to close the distance, to let go of the restraint that had held me back for so long. He took a step closer, his hand moving to my shoulder, his fingers tracing a gentle path along my collarbone, leaving a trail of warmth in their wake. His gaze held mine, steady and unwavering, and in that moment, I felt as though he were seeing all of me, every hidden thought, every unspoken longing. Without thinking, I leaned into his touch, allowing myself to surrender to the pull that had been building between us from the moment he'd walked through the door. His other hand came up to cradle my face, his thumb brushing softly over my cheek, a touch so tender it made my heart ache with a longing I hadn't realized was there. He leaned in, his breath warm against my skin, his lips barely grazing mine, and I felt a thrill unlike anything I'd ever known. It was a kiss filled with questions and promises, with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to sink into the moment, to let go of every inhibition and surrender to the connection that had blossomed between us. His hands slid down my arms, his touch gentle yet firm, anchoring me as he deepened the kiss, his lips moving with a tenderness that was both soothing and exhilarating. I felt my hands move to his shoulders, my fingers tracing the lines of his back, feeling the solid warmth of his body beneath my touch. The kiss grew deeper, more intense, each moment a gradual unraveling of the barriers that had kept us apart. His hands traveled to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, my heart racing as I gave in to the unspoken desires that had been simmering between us. His arms encircled me, and I felt a surge of warmth as he held me close, his breath mingling with mine in the small space that separated us. The intensity between us grew with each passing second, our connection deepening as the world outside faded away. His fingers traced delicate patterns along my back, moving slowly, reverently, as though he were savoring every moment, every sensation. I felt a shiver run through me as his hands traveled up my spine, coming to rest on my shoulders. He held me there, his gaze meeting mine with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. There was something in his eyes, an unspoken tenderness, a depth of feeling that I hadn't encountered in years. It was a look that spoke of longing, of a connection that transcended words, and I felt my own heart echoing in response. Slowly, he leaned in, capturing my lips in another kiss, this one softer, slower, filled with an aching sweetness that made my heart race. His hands moved to cradle my face, his thumbs brushing gently over my cheeks, a touch so tender it left me trembling. I could feel the weight of his presence, the steady warmth of his body pressed against mine, grounding me even as it set my pulse racing. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, wrapped in each other's warmth, the silence between us filled with unspoken promises. His fingers tangled in my hair, and I felt a thrill as he drew me closer, his lips trailing a gentle path along my jawline, his breath warm against my skin. It was a sensation both exhilarating and soothing, a feeling that seemed to fill every empty space within me. "Are you sure?" he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper, his gaze searching mine as though seeking confirmation. I nodded, unable to find the words to express the depth of my feelings, the quiet certainty that had taken root within me. In that moment, I felt as though I'd found something I hadn't even known I was searching for, a connection, a bond that went beyond the surface, something profound and undeniable. His hand moved to rest on my lower back, guiding me toward the edge of the bed, and I felt my heart quicken as I let myself be drawn into his embrace. There was a carefulness to his movements, a quiet reverence that made me feel cherished, valued, in a way that I hadn't experienced in years. He lowered me onto the bed, his touch gentle, his gaze unwavering as he leaned over me, his fingers tracing light, feathered paths along my arms. The tension between us thickened, the air charged with anticipation, and I found myself lost in the depth of his gaze, in the quiet strength of his presence. His hands roamed down my sides, a slow, steady exploration that sent shivers through me, and I felt myself sinking deeper into the moment, into the warmth and security of his touch. Our breaths fell into sync, a shared rhythm that filled the room, and I felt the last of my reservations slip away, leaving only the quiet certainty that this was where I was meant to be. His hands moved with purpose, each touch a silent declaration, and I responded in kind, my fingers tracing the lines of his back, feeling the solid warmth of his body beneath my hands. Time seemed to blur, each moment blending seamlessly into the next, as we lost ourselves in each other. His kisses grew more insistent, filled with a quiet passion that left me breathless, and I felt myself yielding to him, surrendering to the intensity of the connection that had blossomed between us. Every touch, every movement, was a reaffirmation of the bond we shared, a silent acknowledgement of the emotions that had been building between us from the moment he'd entered the room. The world outside faded into nothingness, leaving only the warmth of his embrace, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear, and the quiet, comforting certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the moment, allowing myself to be fully present in his arms, free from the worries and doubts that had plagued me before. His hands traced gentle patterns along my back, a soothing, tender touch that filled me with a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that I hadn't known in years. I felt his lips press softly against my forehead, a gesture so intimate it made my heart ache, and I knew that whatever happened next, this moment would stay with me forever. We lay together in silence, wrapped in each other's warmth, our breaths falling into a shared rhythm as the room grew dark around us. The night deepened, filling the space with a quiet stillness, and I felt the weight of what we had shared settle over us, binding us together in a way that felt both comforting and bittersweet. After a long while, he shifted slightly, his hand moving to brush a stray lock of hair from my face, his gaze filled with a tenderness that took my breath away. "I don't want this to end," he murmured, his voice barely audible, as though he were afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled between us. I reached up, my hand resting on his cheek, my fingers tracing the lines of his face, memorizing every detail. "Neither do I whispered, my words carrying all the weight of the emotions I couldn't put into words. "But whatever happens, I'll always remember this." He nodded, his eyes filled with understanding, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the kindness, the quiet strength he had shown me. There was a sadness in his gaze, a recognition of the complexity of our connection, yet beneath it all, I could see the same certainty that had taken root within me, a knowledge that what we had shared was real, meaningful, something that would linger long after we parted. We stayed like that for hours, wrapped in each other's arms, exchanging soft whispers and gentle touches, savoring every moment, every small gesture that spoke of the depth of our feelings. It was a communion, a silent exchange of promises that needed no words, a bond that went beyond the physical, a connection that filled the empty spaces within me and left me feeling whole. As dawn began to break, casting a soft, pale light over us, I felt a pang of sadness, a quiet recognition that this moment, as beautiful as it was, couldn't last. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew that I had been given something precious, a gift that would stay with me for the rest of my life. He kissed me one last time, a soft, lingering kiss that held all the tenderness, the longing, the unspoken promises we had shared. And as he pulled back, his gaze met mine, filled with a warmth that made my heart ache. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, and I felt my own eyes fill with tears as I nodded, unable to find the words to express the gratitude, the love that filled me. He rose slowly, gathering his things, and I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and peace. I knew that this was goodbye, yet I also knew that what we had shared would stay with me, a quiet, enduring presence that would fill my life with warmth and light long after he had gone. As the door closed behind him, I lay back, my heart heavy yet full, my mind replaying every moment, every touch, every whispered word. And though I knew that I might never see him again, I felt a quiet joy, a sense of completion, knowing that for one brief, beautiful moment, we had found each other.